Good afternoon, everyone. Contrary to our published programme, unfortunately, we're having a few technical difficulties today, and our chair, Claire, won't be joining us for the first half of this session. So Claire will be along shortly hopefully, once we've resolved these issues. In the meantime, we've got a packed session here for you with a joint presentation to start with and 3 other presentations. During this session, if I could ask you all to review the conference room tab on the right-hand side and submit any questions as they come up, and they will be put to the panelists at the end, and we'll have a really interactive discussion. So today we've got speaking, if I could introduce our first 2 speakers, please, Neil and Ali. I will turn off my screen share so you can access. If you could join us on stage now, please, and we'll begin your talk.
Thanks, Justin. Bear with me as we get the presentation up. I might just do a quick intro for myself and maybe pass through to you, Ali, as well. So I'm Neil. I'm a policy advisor at Infrastructure Victoria. For those of you who do not know or are not familiar with us, we are an independent statutory authority here in Victoria, Australia. And we have 3 main core functions. The first of which is preparing Victoria's 30-year infrastructure strategy. The second of which is providing advice to specific requests from the Victorian government. And the third is actually doing research on some real core areas that we think provide great benefit to Victoria and Victorians. So some of the work that we're going to be presenting today is coming from that third research function. Ali, quick word from you if you want.
Yes, sure. So Ali Inayathusein, National Director of Future Transport at VLC. So I guess the context here is just that we supported the modelling work for this project, and I'll talk a bit more about that shortly. Back to you, Neil.
Thanks, Ali. So transporting Melbourne's to recovery. It was a piece of work that we looked at that focused on the short-term COVID-19 impacts. And we actually used some transport modelling or did some transport modelling to help understand the challenges here. So it's our first report that looked or focused on the transport aspect of COVID-19 and what our recovery could look like. It provided immediate interventions for the Victorian government to consider. And the areas that we looked at were a range of options to enable safe, confident travel to get our city moving again as we saw our workers return to the city and to the suburbs. So it's really that period where we still have COVID-19 or a risk of COVID-19 in the community, but things have really started to settle down and we're in that recovery period. We've modelled 3 major themes. So the first of which is the base case, it's the pre-COVID-19. The second of which you see down there in the second dot point is the COVID-19 impact. So this was the COVID recovery scenarios. The third is the COVID recovery scenarios plus reform. So this was where we actually looked at some of the challenges the transport network is facing and modelled some of the policy responses that could help mitigate the challenges we see across the network. Here's the project cycle or the project life cycle. So as I said, step 1, it's actually modeling the pre-COVID, the base case. We then conducted some research alongside with VLC, looking at public transport patronage, private vehicle use, working from home, how that has been impacted, as well as areas like airport travel and international students here in Victoria. These essentially formed our core assumptions in what we then modelled for the COVID-19 model scenarios. We had step 3 now, core and dialed up scenarios. These represented 2 different or varying levels of severity for our model runs. Step 4, we then looked at those results and asked the question, well, what happens to road congestion? What happens to public transport crowding? And we came up with a series of reform ideas that could help mitigate some of the challenges we saw across the network. The 5th and final one was actually modelling those reform scenarios. And we'll come to those shortly. They were called the flexible work and the active uptake scenarios. I'm going to talk through some of the COVID impacts modelling that we did. So this was COVID-19 and the recovery period without intervention. What we found was, here's some maps of Melbourne, and we found that road congestion in the inner metro region actually increased by around 15%. So that's equivalent to around 100,000 new car trips occurring on the network. In turn, average vehicle speeds reduced by around 20 to 30% compared to the pre-COVID levels, down to around 21 kilometres per hour in the morning peak on average. You can cycle faster than that. Public transport, we looked at some of the patronage across the network, and as an illustration of the density and how many passengers our network was taking, we looked at applying a 1.5 metre distance physical distancing indication between commuters. What we found was, as you'd expect, those morning peak train services really faced the largest challenge. The two figures you see on the bottom here is a nice example of what happens on the road network. So we saw in a metro, represented by the red, shows an increase in car volumes. On the other side, the outer areas of Melbourne, especially in the outer suburbs, actually saw a decrease in road volumes. There's a reason for this. The first of which is public transport is really well serviced, or inner Melbourne is well served by public transport. And in turn, because of our assumptions in the model, we now see that those users on public transport have shifted to private vehicle and are now increasing the levels of congestion in inner Melbourne. So the other aspect and the final theme here is the COVID plus reform scenarios. What I just presented, those model outputs, they presented a dilemma. Despite the greater levels of working from home that we're seeing across the city, we saw high levels of private vehicle congestion and a significant shift away from public transport. Because of that drop in public transport, despite that drop in public transport, a lot of the services actually still had limited opportunity to physically distance. So we had a dilemma here. What we did was we came up with two further reform scenarios to help look at what are some of the ways that we can ease the burden and ease the challenge that we're seeing across the transport network here. So there's two scenarios that we came up with. The first of which is active uptake. This increased the active mode share. So it was looking at shifting some of those practical trips, those trips that could be taken by cycling or by walking away from the public transport and away from the road networks. The other scenario was flexible work. So this wasn't just an increase in the level of working from home, but it actually looked at greater flexibility in working hours. So that allowed workers not only to work from home, but to, if they were going into work, start earlier or later in the day. What we found was it incentivized around 80,000 more trips to be taken in an earlier period in the mornings, which resulted as well in over 90% of the train services we see here in Melbourne, with the ability to operate with ample room inside each carriage for commuters to physically distance. I'm going to pass over, sorry, a few more slides to go. So the question is, well, what are some of the policy responses, or what are some of the policies that could actually help achieve these shifts that I just spoke about, being active uptake and flexible work? What are some of the policies to help get people onto bikes, onto the footpaths, and to work more flexibly? One of the themes is pricing mechanisms. So this was looking around off-peak fares, and we've actually seen the recent introduction here in Melbourne and Victoria of off-peak fares for our train, tram and bus networks. We also suggest removing the free tram zone, and the third of which was incentives to actually encourage people to cycle. So this could even look at things like financial incentives, looking at shifting people either to walk or cycle to work. The second theme is provision of infrastructure. So this is the actual hard built infrastructure. It could be to continue revising our public transport scheduling to support that peak spreading and support with more services during those peak shoulder periods, as well as during the day as well. The other one was delivering larger and more permanent separating cycling corridors. As we know from a lot of the research that's out there, the number one aspect to help people to start taking up cycling, or at least to consider cycling, is their safety on their journey. The third point there is supporting local governments, and we've seen this across the world, to reallocate road space away from traditional methods or traditional vehicles and parking to more catering for pedestrians and economic activity as we return to the CBD and as we return to normal life, I guess. the final one is around government directives and guidance. So this is looking at maintaining clear directives, whether it be mandatory mask use or physical distancing requirements, as well as through signage, increased staffing and enforcement, and managing those capacity limits. I might point to Sydney as a really good case in this example. Early in COVID, they looked at capacity limits, but they also looked at making sure their commuters were well informed on the journeys that they took. So making sure they had the data on crowding, on what services perhaps they should be avoiding and what perhaps they should be actually trying to take. Ali, over to you.
So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about the kind of modelling side and what we did there. So firstly, the model that was used for this work was the Melbourne Agent and Activity-Based Model. This was developed back in 2017 by KPMG and Arup. It uses the MapSim software platform, and the key thing is that it considers daily plans. So it considers for each agent, each individual, all of the journeys that are made during the day and the activities, which helps to model everything in a consistent manner. So the model itself considers route choice, time of day, and mode choice. It doesn't include destination choice, but on the time dimension, it does include a lot of granularity going down to the second level. And a unique feature is in MapSim is that both the demand side and assignment side are agent-based. So that means that you can follow, look at the detailed demographics associated with individuals that are making trips on the network. So as Neil explained earlier, we used the model to develop 2 COVID-19 impact scenarios that were based upon the 2018 base year scenarios, and the kind of key dimensions in which we made changes to input assumptions was around public transport attractiveness, the level of working from home, the level of airport travel carried out, and also the level of kind of international student trip making. Next slide, please. So the way we approached this was at the time Melbourne was in its second lockdown, and other cities in Australia and Auckland, we used as an example from New Zealand, were quite a way ahead. And so we used mobility data from those jurisdictions to understand what a recovery might look like. And so, as with other places globally, what we saw that even when lockdowns and things were wound back and things were back to a kind of COVID normal, that public transport patronage did not recover from declines seen fully, and up to kind of we see in the data. So here in the charts, you can see Apple mobility data showing that you get to kind of 70% of baseline levels. But conversely, for cars, for vehicles, you saw that they largely recovered. Now, what we did is based on this, we looked at these trends and developed mode share targets off the back of these, which were then treated as targets in the model, and we adjusted the attractiveness of public transport in the model to achieve those target mode shares. And as you can see from the table at the bottom, what that resulted in was an assumption of a 5% or 7% increase in car mode share and a substantial decrease in public transport mode share. Next slide, please. The other area that was key was looking at what would happen with working from home. So there we looked at Google workplace activity data and residential activity to understand what the levels of working from home were like in other cities, and found, and the assumption we made based on, we saw in Google data that around many cities recovered to around 80% or just above that. The assumptions we made across the two scenarios were that workplace activity would recover to between 80 and 90% of pre-COVID levels. And what we use that for is a proxy for levels of working from home. And how we distributed the agents that were working from home was we had local surveys in Melbourne of carried out to understand the propensity to work from home in the longer term. And that was done by, so we looked at that by occupation and distributed the working from home agents amongst those. In order to apply the working from home changes, what we did was for all agents who were marked as working from home, we removed their work and business trips. And we also adjusted the destination of all other trips based on, from household travel surveys, what the trip lengths were associated with those that already worked from home. Next slide, please. So for international travelers and students, so as many of you will have seen, COVID had a major impact on airport travel, and we saw that in New Zealand, but also the chart at the bottom shows from mobile phone app-based data, which VLC has analysed, the kind of trends in Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne. And what you see is what you saw up to the point we did this work back in August last year was that there was some recovery in airport travel, but not very big. We also found some data on what was happening with international students and seeing the levels that those were declining at. And based on those, we made some assumptions around what would happen to domestic, to airport travel, and basically assuming a level of recovery in domestic travel, but still international travel being largely closed. And also with student travel, international student levels dropping by between 20 and 60% of their baseline levels. And so what we did in the model there was reduced the airport travel directly, and with the students, we removed those, meaning that all of their trips would be removed from the network. Next slide, please. So the two policy response scenarios that Neil mentioned earlier, so the active uptake scenario, MABM does not explicitly model the mode choice within the mode choice active modes, but it does represent the trips, and so we kind of manually increase those mode shares to the level of the policy response to then see what the outturn impact was. And for the flexible work scenario, we did two things. One was through the same mechanism described on the previous slide, 2 slides ago, we adjusted the level of working from home to reduce the level of work travel by an additional 15%. And we also used parameters within the MATSIM framework to change the preferred start time for work-related trips. Next slide, please. And so that's kind of a quick highlight of what we did there. And in conclusion, we found in this case that the activity-based nature of the model was very helpful because it allowed us to make more consistent assumptions. So when we are, for example, reducing the level of changing the levels of working from home, those assumptions could be made in a consistent manner. And also we had access to the individual kind of demographic variables, such as the occupation of individual agents. It is worth, however, highlighting that most of the outcomes you see are still primarily driven by the input assumptions rather than being outcomes of internal modeling processes. And the MABM model itself within the demand modeling structure doesn't allow changing the activities, the actual activities that are undertaken throughout the day or the destination. So there is some limitation there. But overall, a very good tool for this task. And I guess I just want to leave you finally with the question that what do you all think are the key gaps in our current modeling frameworks, and what is it that we need them to do that can't currently be done? And one of the things I'd offer is just that there's a kind of answer that involves a bit of both. Basically, we need better frameworks to improve in relevant areas, but we also need to be aware that we need to take a quite careful approach to the inputs and deriving the assumptions that we make in different scenarios. Yeah, thank you. And that's everything from us. And I'm not sure if we're going to questions now. I think we're going straight to the next presentation, possibly.
Yes, indeed, we're going to be going to the next presentation. If I could call up Jojo, please.
That'll be me.
Yes, if you could just introduce yourself, please, and then begin your presentation.
Yep, I'll just grab my presentation now. Oops. Can you see it? Cool. So Jojo, Valero here. Good afternoon from Auckland. Good day to everyone outside of Auckland. My name is Jojo Valero. I'm from the Auckland Forecasting Center. So today I'll be presenting what we did during COVID and something beyond that, which is probably now and the next few years. So I'll be talking about two sections during COVID, which is to do with public transport capacity reduction. And we'll also look at recovery scenarios post-COVID. The second part will be what we got, what sort of things we're going doing in terms of preparing for the new normal. To us, new normal is not just COVID; it's also got to do with climate change, which I would argue is probably much bigger than COVID because it will probably last longer. So we'll look at work from home and talk about some disaggregation that we're doing to our models. All the stuff that I'm going to talk about, we use our macro strategic model. It's called MSM. It's a traditional 4-stage model, which was originally developed, was born in 2006. It was rebased in 2016, revalidated. And so it's gone through two major crises now, the GFC and now COVID. Auckland, for the context, is that about 1.7 million people here at the moment. So impact on reduced PT capacity. This is to do with, as we all know, physical and social distancing at public transport services. So we have to reduce the capacity. And the question from the top is obviously what's going to happen to the network when we do that? And what are the problems? Well, this is a big question for us in terms of modeling because our model is it represents an average weekday. It's a normal weekday, so we have to make some adjustments, quick and simple adjustments to the entire modeling process so that we can answer the questions in a reasonable manner. So we use the base comparison would be a 2018 AM peak. We have all other peaks, but for simplicity, we use the AM peak. And because we can produce the transport networks, but the issue is the demand, so we have to make use of what we got. And so what we did is we have to factor them down based on some inputs, collective inputs from experts around Auckland. And so things to do with work from home, reduced travel generally, to do with fear factors of COVID, time shift, obviously physical distancing. And so to manipulate the matrices, we apply them equally across the region because we don't know exactly at that time because we did this around April last year where Auckland is total lockdown. The next step is to determine the PT capacity with physical distancing. So we look at the sizes of our buses and our trains and our ferries, and we sort of make an estimate on what their capacity will be in terms of social distancing. So what we did is the next thing we did is to limit the demand to mass reduce capacity. And then with excess PT demand, we have to move them to cars. So we look at different levels of reduction from 40% to 90% of the base demand. And we end up setting up the PT capacities to about 22%. In simple terms, we just run the PT and road network assignments and compare the results. In summary, I guess what we can have is that we will be able to accommodate about 80% of total demand with 37% of PT capacity. The biggest issue is obviously because CBD, all our PT services are radial, all our PT services are radial, so those go to CBD, and so there are some issues here in terms of demand. But what actually happened was that didn't materialize. This issue didn't materialize that much because we made policy changes and that governments allowed people to go on buses and trains as long as they wear masks. So this didn't materialize. The next COVID-related work that we did is with more of a long-term recovery scenario. So we were given on the right-hand side here is the economic scenarios that we can expect, and so we have the future reference case scenario, which is pre-COVID. The high case, which is the blue line, is a short-term sort of blip, and then we'll recover at a much slower, although much slower pace, but we recover instantly. The central case, which is the medium, is medium recovery, and the low case is, the recovery takes quite longer. So those are the real GDP per capita scenario. On the left-hand side, the blue table there, these are the years and the inputs that we need to adjust to sort of mimic the impact of COVID. So inputs to do with work from home, PT capacity, and boarding penalties. The boarding penalties we think is kind of interesting because we think that with COVID, there will be this boarding penalty represents the fear factor of people using public transport. And so we have different levels of factors for each of the cases, from reference being 1 and the low scenarios being the lowest sort of factors. And as we move on to the future, the factor seems to sort of settle down, and in 2038, 48, they all seem to be very similar to the reference case, except for the work from home, which we think will linger much longer than the other factors. One of the learnings that we did when we do this was that obviously when we have different economic scenarios, we have to make adjustments to our car ownership. And what we found is that car ownership has got an income variable in it, and that's the formula. And when you put a negative growth rate, it just doesn't work. So what the other lesson that we found is all our models, the models that we currently have, are set up for growth. It's not set up for decline in growth. So that's a good lesson for us in this exercise. In terms of the recovery scenarios, this is the a graph showing. This is kind of nice because this was done for us by the people who help us with this reporting. They took our numbers and they make it more realistic. So this is the reference case at the top, and then the central, the median, the high, the central, and the low scenarios. And the black line is the actual boarding on public transport. So it's the modeling that we did, it kind of sort of tracked the high growth scenarios, except for when we had another lockdown in August last year. So this is kind of very comforting for us. The second part now, we go into the second part now, which is the new normal. One of the things I think a lot of people has now mentioned work from home, and the catalyst for this is that during COVID, technology enabled work from home. A lot of companies support work from home. Even here, a lot of people are working from home part-time, 2 days at home, 3 days in the office. There are anecdotal evidence, so I haven't seen it, but I guess in the US, there are households locating to other places, to the suburbs instead of the central city. I think people are also conscious about their contribution to climate change. And then there is an expectation that, I think there's a lot of agreement that this will continue on in the future. So what we did is, this is the one in the middle is this is the structure of our model. And so the work from home it's an assertion, and it's which is in the it's after the mode choice model, and it's part of the demand loop iteration. So it affects generalized cost. What we did is, as it's a proportional reduction in commuting trips, home based to work. It's occupation based. So because there are a lot of, for example, there are a lot of office works in the CBD, then that's where the reductions are expected to occur. Fortunately, Stats New Zealand did a survey during Alert Level 2 around June, specifically on work from home data, so we managed to use that. At the moment, the current input assumption is that 5% of home-based work will be work from home. We have implemented this in our model now. The other thing to do with the new normal in terms of what we're doing is that Auckland is now in a climate emergency that's officially declared, and we all know that CO2 is, transport has got high contribution to CO2. So the key policy measures now is to change behavior and invest more in public transport. But because our model was made in 2006 and it's only got about 600 zones, it's kind of old, and at that time PT is not a big thing. I think it's very low mode share across the region. So this aggregating the zones is one way of addressing the key disadvantage of the current model, such that because this model it's used mainly for supporting business cases of major projects. In all of the major projects that you're aware of, MSM was used to in the evaluation of those projects. The model is also used to develop and support regional plans and strategies. Those documents that 10-year long-term plans. So this model has got a lot of use. The chart here, and this will be familiar to you, this is the tripling distribution between the 600 zone and the 1100 zone system. This is very encouraging results because we attempted to do this back in 2016 when we tried to update our model, but we were told that this is a cardinal sin because mainly because the utility functions were calibrated based on 600 zone system, and there is a good chance that we may not be able to validate and calibrate this if we extend it to 1100. But this is very encouraging. We are making most of what we have, and as I've said, we haven't changed any of the utility parameters. It's still intact. We're doing this mainly because the best opportunity for us to build a new model will be in 2023 when the census comes. And so if we are successful with this, then we still got at least 5 years of use of this model. So yeah, we are investing quite a bit of time on this. I think this is the last slide. I've got, if there's any questions about the PT reduction assumptions, I've got slides, but I think that's my presentation.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Jojo. Yes, anyone who's got any questions, please do remember to put them in the question and answer panel under the conference tab on the right-hand side. Unfortunately, our session chair, Claire Thompson, is experiencing technical difficulties, so won't actually be able to join us today. However, Frank Milthorpe, our final speaker, has kindly offered to step into the breach following his presentation. Next up, we have Tim Price from Transport for London. Unfortunately, Tim will be unavailable to answer questions during the discussion panel later, as he can't join us this afternoon. But he has kindly pre-recorded his presentation for us, and we're about to play that for you now.
Good evening. I'm Tim Price from Transport for London. I'm the demand forecasting manager here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the use of models to predict a new normal with a case study of London. So here at TfL, we have a new transport model. It's called Motion. That's a model of transport in London. And this model uses 5 demand modules to forecast trip changes and mode shift. Now, if you can see on this diagram, we have the inputs on the left-hand side, so inputs such as population, demographics, employment, economics and transport policy, and the output is total trips, mode share, travel times, crowding and congestion. Now, the input on the left-hand side is our London population simulator, LOPOPS, which creates a future London population based on demographic targets. This then goes through a tour frequency module, and based on the population demographic input, we predict the number of tours for each purpose. The next stage is a mode and destination choice, which is forecasting trip patterns by each mode, which iterates with a parking model, which is applying constraint based on available capacity. We then pivot from that synthetic model to our assignment models. Those of you who know TfL's models, they are Loam for the highway model, which is built in Saturn, Cinnamon, which is our cycling model built in Cube, and Railplan built in ME. One of the key differences that Motion gives us that our previous model, LTS, didn't have is a richer segmentation, which informs mode choice behavior. So, for example, if you look at this diagram on the screen here, you can see that income can have an influence on how people travel. For example, higher incomes using rail. Gender can have an influence, particularly with cycling. We have more detail about car ownership and forecasting how this affects transport demand choices in London. Working status with different mode preferences by part-timers. Household structure, which is important for escorting other people in the household, and car passenger travel. And then age, with different tour rates for all different purposes, but particularly shopping, and different modal preferences by age as well. So this has become a very handy model to have right at the time that it was released back in March of 2020, because a lot of these new features in Motion helped us to model post-pandemic scenarios. So again, it's the same diagram, but just to kind of explain how we use the model. So, for example, with income, this can affect who is unemployed. So if different people, different income groups are more likely to end up being unemployed, this will affect commuting tour rates. But it also affects working from home, because again, if we can find evidence to suggest that those with higher incomes are more likely to work at home, then we can include that in our tour frequency model. And the car ownership, mid-pandemic, car ownership was a huge driver of frequency of travel, particularly for those that didn't have a car available, and public transport was basically a no-go. That was quite restrictive. When we look at longer term, then there's a potential that car ownership could rise. With gender, there could be some gender impacts during and post-pandemic, and we kind of looked to see if any people have done research in this, and particularly with sort of public transport alternatives. We do know from our data of the preferences to cycle that that's something that men prefer to do as an alternative to PT as opposed to women. With age, in our short-term modelling, again, we were able to use the disaggregate nature of the model to reduced tour rates for the elderly, particularly in our short-term modelling. And with working status, again, as I mentioned, sort of could be huge variations really in working from home, dependent on the types of jobs that people do. And equally, as we sort of looked at sort of economic forecasts of different sectors that might be affected, you know, that all has an impact on unemployment as well. But with a disaggregate model, as motion is, this is you know, extremely useful for doing these things, but it doesn't stop people to be able to model these trends with more aggregate models. It's just a case of using the best data that you have and the best model that you have to be able to predict the future. So TfL City Planning established an analytical framework for the recovery planning. You can sort of see this here. So we split this up into sort of 2 time periods, really, sort of an initial recovery stage, some months after the restrictions are lifted. And we have 2 scenarios here. One is called a return to nearly normal. And in this scenario, effectively, people go back to reasonably similar pre-existing behaviours. However, there are sort of economic shocks of the pandemic and some dissuasion away from public transport and sort of some people that have decided to that the flexible working that was offered in you know, in the last year is something that they and their companies are happy to continue with. The same also for shopping. Hybrid change is a little bit more radical, with sort of stronger reductions in sort of commuting, with more people working from home. And these 2 scenarios sort of feed into our longer term runs. So we've forecast effectively a reference case that sort of continues those trends, and what we, again, this hybrid change, which is a little bit more radical. Now you can see sort of circling each of these forecasts are 5 scenarios. Now I'm going to introduce these in a little bit, but these are sort of points of an uncertainty. So we've sort of expanded it even further as well to really in these times to make sure that there's sort of further robustness in our modelling and analysis. So we've come up with 5 possible scenarios for London's future. They're on the screen for you here. So the first one of these is return to business as usual. And this is a story of London bouncing back quite quickly, and London looks as we were sort of planning to do, for it to look like pre-pandemic. This middle one, London fends for itself, is a story of lower growth in London. There's challenges here, particularly with the fallout from the virus, and London and the UK's diminished status in the wider world. On the right-hand side, low carbon localism is a smaller but much more sustainable London. The impact of the virus is significant in people's behaviour, and people have decided to stay a lot more local and use the sort of major centres in the CBD an awful lot less. Then we have remote revolution. It's a successful city, but quite a very different city. Technology has changed just the way that people live, work, and travel. As you can imagine, a lot of working from home in this one. Agglomeration is a supercharged London, but still an unequal London. So there's changes to the global economy, and London looks to enhance its global competitive advantage. So what we've tried to do is establish the factors that we think would affect each of these scenarios, and then sort of consider data that is available, and quantify that, and eventually model it. So on the right hand side, on the left hand side, you can see the impact and public health response, potential resurgence of the virus, what's the likelihood of that, and whilst we hope that that's not the case, it's certainly something to think about. Social distancing and isolation measures, quite how long they would be maintained, and particularly in our shorter term stuff, that was an important thing. There's a number of things on government response, which could give different outcomes, rebalancing, potential ways to tackle the climate emergency, government stimulus, in that bottom left-hand corner. Then there's economic impact, just all about London's place in the world economy, the scale of the economic recovery, the return of business and tourist travel. And then there's sort of changes to travel behaviour. So you can see sort of the amount of remote working, online and remote shopping, attitudes to public transport, and attitudes to shared space, for example. And on the right-hand side, we have changes in the wider transport sector, sort of implications for freight, new mobility, and supply chains. So for each of these things, what we've tried to do is use our research. We've looked at things that are national and global, and use this really to quantify the impacts on whether that's trip rate or mode share. We have a module for sort of cycle propensity, which sort of affects cycle travel behaviour, for example. Economic impact, of course, as you saw at the start of this pack, the amount of employment and the influences the model. So making sure that is all quantified, and we end up with a range of outcomes across the key factors. And as you can see, not one of these scenarios sort of sits all the way to the left or all the way to the right. There is a wide range of responses, really, based on, dependent on that sort of individual scenario. So it's not a case of low and high anymore. It's a case of picking out the most appropriate outcome for that scenario. So in conclusion, we've built a new model which helps us to plan for an uncertain future. There's plenty of features that are new to Motion that have been extremely helpful for planning for this uncertain future. Whilst the sophistication there is helpful, the best course of action always is to use the best data and best models available to you at the time. One thing we found is that usually strategic variable demand models are used to predict changes that might happen over decades. But because decades of change happened in the course of a few months, then they were of use, they were of value in the recovery phase. Over longer timeframes, we've got these 5 scenarios, and we've looked at those, quantified those to sort of understand the range of outcomes. This can be a challenge for those in policy in particular, because there's more than one outcome. But one should always see that as a positive, as you can plan for a robust future. And finally, we've used a wide range of models and techniques, not just those like we take through today, really dependent on what type of answer was required, how quickly that answer was required. It's also highlighted the usefulness of more disaggregate techniques, and we've started to look at ABMs as a possibility for London. And we'll be looking to see how that will fit into motion suites in the future. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'm not here because it's about 5 o'clock in the morning UK time, but you can contact me on the email address on this slide page. Thank you.
Oh, hello there. Hi, if we could have Frank up now, please. Your presentation, if you could begin that now.
Okay, my name is Frank Milthorpe. I'm currently leading the group of transport modelers across freight, demographics, traffic, strategic in Sydney, our state office, state government, and I've had a history of transport modelling for many years, and most relevant is responsible for development of the Sydney strategic travel model, which is a tour-based model. So the talk today I've titled Challenges in Predicting the New Normal, and part of this talk, I want to first look at, well, what questions are we being asked to answer, touch on typical modelling life cycle, some of the challenges we've had in doing this, and talk about modelling working from home. But then I also want to challenge us and think about some implications for us as a profession. So this is a bit of an overview of some of the work that we've actually done in Sydney. So what are some of the questions that we're being asked? So one thing is short term, and by short term, I mean, we've got internal stakeholders that want month by month public transport usage. They're the people particularly concerned with finance and wanting to know, well, how much revenue is going to come in the door, because we've been operating this full suite of public transport services as normal and with significantly reduced levels of occupancy. That is sort of work that's best covered by time series analysis, and our multimodal long-term strategic models aren't really suitable to that, and I'm not going to talk about that short term anymore. So longer term, which is bread and butter for our strategic models, basically the question we're being asked is, well, are we building the correct infrastructure? The infrastructure that we're planning, big rail projects, big road projects, should we still be building them in the light of COVID? So let's just think of a typical model life cycle. We generally go and have a bit of base year travel survey data, household travel survey, etc. We spend a bit of time, or a lot of time, creating base year transport networks, including a bit of pricing data and the demographics, bundle that all up together and spend a lot of time estimating behavioural models. We then implement those into a model system. We spend some time calibrating and validating, and then we apply that model for future years with a huge range of different inputs. But generally, we leave the model, the core of of the actual model unchanged. So if we're coming to model the impacts of COVID, typically in our approaches, the changes we make are either changes to demographic inputs or changes to transport system inputs. Transport system inputs for our models are not really the core of the work in this environment, and we can just change the transport system as and how we've done for the last several decades. Demographic inputs, again, bread and butter, we can change that without, we've had years and years of experience of changing that. What about the mathematical behavioral choice equations, which are really the grunt of our models? Normally these have been unchanged in application. It's sort of almost a set and forget. We do actually have pandemic impacted usage data, particularly in our public transport system in Sydney. We have data of every single public transport trip. We have a tap on and tap off payment system. Great for us as modelers to have that sort of data collected and outsourced, and the responsibility for collection of that data outsourced to someone else so that we just tap into it. We also have some road usage count data, but we don't have the detailed travel survey data with all the social demographics that we would normally have when we're going and building a model. And any data that we do collect right now is pandemic travel, impact travel, and that does not reflect the new normal. And yet we're being asked to model what is the new normal behavior going to be. So what does this mean for our COVID modeling impacts? We've got demographic projections with lower population growth. Sydney has, by Western country standard, very high levels of overseas immigration, and that's really what's fueling our population growth. Plugging in reduced population growth, we can do that. We've done it all the time. Nothing very new about that. And that's, yeah, we just do that all the time. So really what we're talking about is modeling changed travel behavior. So as we all know, there's increased working from home. However, research that's floating around is only about 40% of our people can work from home. If this was uniform, well, we could just drop the trip rates for working of commuter work trips, whack it into a model, and that would be dead easy. That's not the case. We have a very uneven distribution of the workplaces of these people who can work from home. The people who can work from home are basically office workers, knowledge workers, or whatever title you want to give to us. And the spatial distribution of those workplaces is very unequal, i.e. scat, it's a CBD and a few other major centres. For other travel purposes, there are varying levels of impacts. School education, we're seeing increased car drop-off pickup. We're attributing this partly attributing this to parents who are working from home who now have the opportunity to take their children to school, whereas if they were working in their regular office, well, then they didn't have that. Tertiary education, tertiary students at the moment have a reduced presence on campus, and so there's less of them travelling to their tertiary institutions. Business travel is severely limited, both with it, particularly interstate or between city, but even within city travel, there's just less business travel happening. Shopping is probably similar, maybe small increase. And so the quick conclusion we have is our standard tools are not designed for a black swan event like COVID-19. So what are our options for trying to model working from home? There's really three different approaches that we could take. One is to actually try to get into the inside of your big strategic travel models and change some of the model components. In theory, that sounds nice and simple and easy, but we have quite complex interactions particularly between frequency models and destination choices. And we don't have, even though our Sydney model has about 80 segments for work at the mode and destination choice model. So those segments are income, car ownership, car availability, and full-time, part-time work. That's not the right segmentation for implementing a working from home model. The segmentation that we're more likely to need is, if we think of the old days, we used to have perhaps white collar, blue collar segmentation. Nowadays, we need an office worker, non-office worker segmentation. A second approach is post-processing of existing model results. So take the matrices that come out and then apply some adjustments. This is a lot less interventionist, a lot easier to implement, and it also does allow the potential for us to pivot from our current behavior. So we've got good socio-demographics on occupations, both at the home end and at the destination end, and therefore we can apply adjustments to that travel, and therefore you have significantly less travel to office type locations such as the CBD, but almost the same level of travel as previously to more the warehouse, industrial, factory type locations. So that's a way that we can come up with some results and try and match what we can see on the ground. A third approach, and what we're currently working on, is using an external propensity for working from home model. So David Henscher at Sydney University is developing a standalone working from home model as part of detailed research that they're undertaking. And this allows, and essentially it can have different segmentation and not be compatible with our strategic model, but we can apply that model and use that in the same way that we're talking about our post-processing of existing model results, but actually have that post-processing based on actual mathematical equations and not just educated guesses. So let's think about what this actually means for our profession as a whole. Typically, we don't change our model components, as we're all aware, yet black swan events require a change. We typically don't have changing travel behavior preferences within our models as we apply them going forward over time. So if we were to step back and just assume that we were back in 2019 and hadn't heard of COVID, in 2019, particularly in Sydney, we've had travel surveys, continuous travel surveys for more than 20 years. So we've got the travel survey data, a little bit more of an issue with getting historical network data on a totally consistent basis. Public transport side, GTFS has not been around for 20 years, but I'm sure we could make do. So I think as a profession, we need to think how we might implement this changing travel behavior preferences using existing data and existing historical data, and then we could back check this for backcasting. Along comes COVID as what I'm calling a black swan event. Now we want to actually get in and fiddle with our models and perhaps implement changes. So one example is destination choice models. We all know how to do that in the current place, but what is possibly likely to happen in the future is office workers moving away from inner suburbs more to outer suburbs if they're going to travel less frequently. So if they're only going to travel into the office 2 days a week, well, maybe that they'll prefer to live further out because that, and still only spend the same, and still spend less total travel time commuting per week than they did previously. That sort of, but we don't, how do we implement that into our model given that we don't have empirical data on which to base this right now? What we're talking about is modeling people's changing preferences, but without the data to support it. So as a challenge for us as a profession is, what is the appropriate mix between our purely empirical models that we've always had and what I'd call modeler-based scenario or modeler fiddler, where depending upon how we fiddle or tweak our results, the changes that we make basically influence the results that we're going to give out in the end. So in summary, our existing tools are not suitable for black swan events, but I would also argue that we can't design our existing tools for black swan events. What we need to think about is, how do we possibly think about making our tools a bit more open so that they're a bit more amenable to agile interventions rather than our previous historical ways of not having them as being easy. They're the opposite of agile for modification. They're sort of hard, difficult and clunky to modify. Also, looking into the future, we don't have a traditional data available. And so I think this implies that we require alternative approaches. So we can use models, or we could implement these alternative approaches to provide us insights into these alternate scenarios. What this means is we're going to have less confidence with these results than we would have with our standard models, because there's a lot more model intervention. And I'm reminded of the famous quote from George Best: all models are wrong, but some are useful. So the challenge for us is how to develop models that are useful and the best that we can do. So that's the end of my presentation. So I think that means that I'm now also stepping into doing the Q&A. So Steve Petrowski has asked, question for Neil and Ali. The Melbourne activity MABM is an activity-based model, and he understands it has significant runtime. Did these excessive runtimes limit the number of scenarios that could be assessed?
I might have a go at this one, Ali, first. Short answer, yes. And that means it's really important for us to prioritize what scenarios and what policy responses we thought had the most potential and were the most important here in Melbourne. So in our case, having those two first COVID-19 recovery scenarios being the core and the dialed up scenario were a really strong feature of that. So we could see, well, we could see both sides. We could see the low impact and we could see the high impact scenarios or the results from COVID. And then being able to test different policies. In this case, we came up with two as being the most important and being the most transformative as an opportunity here in Victoria, being that active change in active modes and flexibility in work. Ultimately, you know, the more runs, the better, the more data you can get. But in the time that we had this project and the time that we had to do it to make sure that it was meaningful and useful, remember, this was released early this year. So we were working on this towards the end of 2020. throughout the lockdowns, the second lockdown here in Victoria, as well as various other lockdowns that we've had. But it was just making sure that we balanced those priorities, making sure it was timely advice in the end.
Okay, next question to Jojo from Lindsay Oxlade. How do you achieve trust in your modelling results and process from your decision makers and politicians?
That's a very good question. I think the first thing we do is that we've been working with politicians, so they are familiar with the results of our models at this stage. And so what we're trying to establish the credibility of the models. And so I think key validation and calibration is something that we sort of ensure that they are up to date. And because politicians, they want, the most up-to-date information, like for some. That's the reason why we updated our models to 2016. It's quite old now, so we're going on 2018, and that's the reason why we try to update our model as quickly as possible within a reasonable time frame, because politicians want, fresh information, not 5 years old or 10 years old. They want information now as much as possible.
Okay, so next question is from Lindsay Oxlade to myself. Your post-processing process seems to have a negative impact on the concept of transport land use integration. How will this be addressed in the new models? Part of the challenge is what is the interaction between where people live and work, and is that going to change, and and what do we do in the absence of data on which to tweak our models? Now, what we could do is relax the costs, so to speak, in the destination choice. And again, we need to recognize this, but it comes back to the point that I was trying to make earlier, is how much do we want to be developing scenarios without the strong empirical evidence that we've traditionally worked on? So question for Ali or Neil from Hank Tail. Does the airport travel really have an impact on the total traffic in the Melbourne region?
Let's start with that one, Neil. Feel free to add anything, but essentially, at a Melbourne-wide level, especially the impacts are not large. The reason for including that, however, is the localized impact on, for example, CBD to the airport travel, some of the key freeways that access the airport. So that's where the impacts are greater, really.
Okay, next question for Jojo from Lindsay Oxlade. Have you been able to achieve buy-in from other related agencies, e.g. population, employment, social services, welfare agencies and private sector investors?
Yeah, the good thing about modeling here in Auckland is that we used an agreed set of input assumptions relating to our population projections, employment projections, and things like that. So, those projections are not only used for transport modeling, but for asset management, like the water companies use them to sort of allocate where their projects is going to be in terms of where growth, supporting future growth in different areas of the region. So as I've said, we have an agreed set of population and employment projections for the region, and that's being used by everyone. Although, there are instances where, we have to pivot off that to do some sensitivities, but the good thing is we got a base that's agreed upon by everyone, every stakeholders.
Question from Lindsay Oxlade to myself. Should we as modelers adopt the vision and manage and not predict and provide approach? I think there's a range of purposes that stakeholders want our model answers for. And one of the key things that our team provides answers to is project evaluation. And at the moment, we have rigorous cost-benefit analysis frameworks. And so unless we can tweak the project evaluation criteria, I'm not totally sure how vision and manage can be implemented without moving totally to vision and manage without changing our cost-benefit analysis project. Question for Ali and Jono from Philip Summer. In your cities, are the work trips that can be replaced by working from home typical of all work trips, or are they longer or shorter?
I'm just going to reread that question. So...
It's towards the top.
Yep, got it.
22 minutes ago.
Yeah. So in terms of the way that we've made that adjustment, the trip length itself, I would have thought is going to be typical. The way we did that was by occupation. We haven't looked at trip length of the trips that in a huge amount of detail, but there isn't anything we've done to bias that in any way. So I would imagine that the trip length is probably the kind of typical trip length. The only other thing I guess to add is that by picking certain occupations, they are more likely to work in the CBD and also more likely to have a commute by public transport. So that will have an effect on the trip length.
Yes, similarly in Auckland, our work from home module is based on occupation. So we look at where the jobs are and what type of jobs there are, and that's where reduction is implemented. So it doesn't take into account the trip length, whether they're short or longer.
Question for Ali/Neil from Lindsay Oxlade. Given your experience with scenario modelling, do you agree that modelling post-pandemic should be greater uptake of scenario modelling and analysis with stress testing of assumptions?
I generally would agree with that, Lindsay. I think stepping back here, we need to remember that to undertake the modelling that we did, we were using a model that was calibrated to pre-COVID, and we needed to, in changing those assumptions and parameters, we need to look at whatever live data that we could and most recent data that we could, whether it be from Google, Mobility, Apple data, my key ticketing counts, road counters, to really, I guess, recalibrate the model to best represent the COVID recovery that we saw. So I think moving forward, it is a very important aspect of the future scenarios or scenario modeling that we're doing. But I think we should also be conscious of, I guess, where we plateau to, or where we settle down, and try and, I guess, recalibrate and find that balance again in the future. So yes, a very important point.
Okay, Frank. I think that scenario representing multiple scenarios is something we hear a lot and is something that we need to be doing more of. But I think there's a lot that comes alongside that. We need to make it easier for decision makers to be able to use the outputs from multiple scenarios, because otherwise we're adding a lot of information, but not enough insight in a sense. And so that's where I think when we're seeing all these advances in web-based visualization, in dashboarding, all of these things become important alongside that. And then also moving towards more nuanced conversations, I think, and that appetite has to come from decision makers as well, because ultimately we can present what what could happen in a number of different scenarios, but ultimately there's a discussion that's needed to then evaluate those and understand what policy responses need to be made in relation to that. So I think there's a lot that needs to go. Although I agree with the underlying principle, but I think there's a lot that needs to go alongside that to make that happen. And I'd be keen to hear any other views on that as well, actually.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat other than 2 for Tim who can't answer them. So if you've got a question or if I've missed it, please pop it into the chat again. Otherwise, I'm going to ask Neil and then Jojo and then Ali to share any thoughts or observations that they've got on this topic based on their presentation, the other presentations they've heard, and on the questions that you've had.
Ask a question, actually, if that's okay, of perhaps yourself, Frank, and
yep.
Jojo and Neil, actually, is I guess how are you handling the kind of push towards kind of scenario planning and what that means for assessing policy and infrastructure decisions? Are there any things that you're doing differently, or that you see as a trend in terms of being done differently going forward?
We're not doing anything differently for actual project assessment right now. It's in the back of my mind that we need to think about this, but this is a complicated. If you think of all the momentum that big agencies have towards the project assessment, cost benefit analysis, and the process and projects that are in flight, and we're also have an environment where there's a lot of money being poured into transport projects, and that's happening all the time, and we can't just say, oh, well, let's just stop and let us think about a different approach. So we're thinking about it, but haven't actually changed anything in the actual project evaluation space at this stage. We've got some guidance on a bit of sensitivity analysis, but that's not for the core evaluations.
Yeah, similarly, in terms of evaluation, we haven't really changed it, but the way information is being requested and looked at by stakeholders has changed a bit in this part, because the emphasis is now more on, because you got this new normal being COVID and climate change, the emphasis and investment is focused more towards public transport and walking and cycling. And so that's why we've decided to say, well, 500 sounds is not going to cut it for us in the future. So we have to try a much more disaggregated zoning system, mainly to do with public transport assignments, because people, in the past, they only look at total boardings and lightings for the region and total PT patronage. But now, people are interested in station boardings and mode transfers and things like that. And so the other thing is that I haven't mentioned is that part of our preparation for the new normal is we also build a strategic active mode model. So it's a separate model for active modes being walking and cycling. So it's fairly strategic, but it's something that we can tap on because there is we can see the demand for it in the future, well, now, I guess. Yeah.
I think as a more general comment, Ali, the pandemic has most likely emphasized the need. I'll start again. Traditionally, we've looked at that the infrastructure project, the main project, as the key. But I think even more than ever, COVID-19 has emphasized the need to consider policy responses, consider future trends, whether it be in land use patterns, in population patterns, down to how people make decisions, whether they go to work every day or they work from home, whether a changing an economy influences and impacts major transport projects. So I think the pandemic has really sped things up in that sort of thinking around, what are some of the complementary policy ideas, trends, and future expectations that we see that might partner along with projects in their assessment.
Okay, so no more questions have come in, so I'd like to thank my fellow presenters, Neil, Jojo, Ali, and thank you all for your attendance. And I don't know whether there's anything coming back from the organisers. Otherwise, my understanding is the next session, ANZ, I'll let Justin talk about ANZ4 and next steps, I think.
Yes, that's right. ANZ4 will be taking place in Conference Room 1. That'll be kicking off in about half an hour's time. So this leaves everyone plenty of opportunities to catch up in the network area, have a bit of a break, visit the exhibition, and we'll see you again in half an hour. But thank you, everyone, for your talks today.
Cool.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks,
Cheers,
everyone.
guys.